nearly every crime has two essential elements: the mens rea, which is the mental part of the crime, and then the actus reus, which is the physical part of the crime. Here we're going to be talking about the mens rea. Now, at common law, and this principle is still adhered to today in all the states, you don't have a crime without a guilty mind. It's a common law principle. Now, there's an exception to that, and the exception is what we call strict liability crimes. And there's more about that in just a bit. Now, at common law, some crimes were defined as requiring a general intent, where the defendant intended to do the wrongful act. And then there were some crimes, which were generally more serious crimes, where a specific intent was or is required. And that's where the defendant intended the particular result. And so the higher level crime requires a more specific intent. Now, several concepts dealing with mens rea. The first one is what we call scienter. And that is the concept or the requirement that the defendant have knowledge of a particular fact that is an element of the crime. So an example would be if the person is charged with receiving or possessing stolen property, well, the defendant, that person, has to have knowledge that that property was indeed stolen. Or another example would be assaulting a police officer. You'd have to know that the person that is the victim in that alleged crime is a police officer. If you take that knowledge out of the equation and the defendant really doesn't have that knowledge, then they can't be charged with that particular offense. There may be other offenses that could be charged, but not that particular one. So once again, that's called scienter. Now, we also have the notion known as transferred intent, and it's the same notion that we see over in tort law, where the defendant or the accused person might be intending a particular harm, but because of a bad aim or because of something else happening, that their original intent does not come true, and they end up harming someone else or causing a different harm. So under the law, with this concept of transferred intent, we say that, well, the original intent to causing that original harm, the intended harm, is transferred to the intent to cause the harm that was actually caused. So it's transferred intent. Then we get to strict liability, something I mentioned a moment ago. Here, a strict liability crime can be proven just by proving the act, and that there's no particular guilty mind that's even required. Examples would be a traffic offense. Lower level offenses like city ordinances frequently, or traffic violations, don't have a particular intent that is required. Like someone has to be proven that you intentionally ran the stop sign in order to charge someone with running the stop sign. It's a strict liability crime. You did the act, then you're convicted of it. Perhaps better example would be DWI. Hopefully not too many people intentionally drive drunk. I would imagine the great bulk of people who are accused of DWI think they're just fine, and but nevertheless they drove while they were impaired. Doesn't matter whether you intended to or even knew you were impaired. You did it, you were impaired, you committed the crime. Statutory rape would be another one. Another example. Doesn't matter what your intent was, if you do the act, you've committed the crime. Now, another concept we need to talk about is motive. Motive is the why someone commits an act. It's not the same thing as intent. It's not the same thing as the guilty mind, blameworthiness, or what we might call culpability, but the motive, the why they did it, might help prove that they did have a particular state of mind if it is required by the law. A couple other concepts here dealing with mens rea. Vicarious liability, that's being criminally, legally responsible for the acts of another because you have some sort of relationship between those two people. An example would be an employer that's responsible for failure to comply with safety regulations. Even though the employer did not know that the employee wasn't following the regulations and did not have any knowledge that, let's say it's a product or a service that had to meet a certain level of a certain standard, the employer may not have even known that the work was substandard. But depending on the circumstances, the employer may very well be held liable for that employee's wrongful act. Examples would be frequently cited in textbooks and such. It was the Warner-Lambert case where an employer was held responsible for the death of an employee because of safety conditions at the plant. Or the Ford Motor Company case with the Ford Pinto, where it was alleged that company executives or management was aware of the hazard that was created by the gas tank on this automobile. It was called the Ford Pinto, but yet they failed to take certain actions to remediate the situation, and a number of people died, and so criminal charges were brought at the state level against Ford Motor Company. Other examples in Texas, for example, a nursing home experienced a lot of deaths, saw a lot of deaths of residents, and the state came in and charged the nursing home with murder because of particular allegations that were being made. So even though, and this ties in with corporate liability, can a corporation be charged with a crime? Well, how does a corporation act? Through its agents. But the corporation is treated as a legal person, but it's not the corporation that made the decision on the gas tank on Ford Motor. Well, you say, well, yeah, it was because they made their decision through the agents. Well, that's where the corporate liability comes in. So it depends on vicarious liability, and in some cases, that superior happens to be a corporation. And so, yes, a corporation may be charged with a crime. But you're generally going to see this when the employee is acting in the course and scope of their employment, and when the act that was done was maybe authorized or directed by the corporation, or if it's an omission where an act was supposed to be taken but wasn't taken, that the corporation did have a duty to act in those circumstances. In any event, when the employee does the act or there is an omission by the employee is still likely going to be liable for their own conduct, regardless of what happens to the corporation. Okay, now so far we've been talking about the common law approach, traditional approach to mens rea. What we're going to talk about now is the current approach. Now, there are 4 states of mind: guilty mind, 4 states of blameworthiness, 4 states of mind of culpability, criminal culpability. You can use any of those terms that that we see in the modern approach that is demonstrated in the model penal code. And not all states have adopted the model penal code, but even in states that have not adopted the penal code may have adopted this particular approach to blameworthiness. The idea is that the highest level of blameworthiness would be called intentional. And there you have a conscious desire to commit the act or achieve the result. A conscious desire. And so that would be someone saying, I want to cause your death. Boom. That is my intent, my conscious desire. That's intentional. Now, knowing you don't intend to cause it, but you have a reasonable certainty that the result is going to happen from your particular act. You know that your act is going to result in a particular harm. And that would be knowing. Reckless would be yet another step below that. Here you're aware of a substantial risk, but you ignore that risk and you consciously disregard that risk. So sometimes we call that conscious risk creation. You're creating a risk, you know about it, you hope nothing bad happens, but if it does, well, you're criminally liable. The fourth one is going to be with criminal negligence. And when you commit an offense with criminal negligence, you ought to be aware of the risk, but you're not. Let's see how these play out now. In Texas, Texas has not adopted the model penal code, but it follows this system of setting out blameworthiness. And we're going to use the Texas murder statute. Homicide statutes, just not murder, but all the homicide statutes. And they say, word for word, a person commits an offense if he, what? The murder statute says if he intentionally or knowingly causes the death of another. So either one of those states of mind will get you murder. A person commits an offense if he recklessly causes the death of another. Well, that's manslaughter, and that's going to be punished less harshly than murder would be. Or a person commits an offense if he causes the death of another with criminal negligence. And that's criminally negligent homicide. So once again, we have death. What's in common with all three of these crimes? Murder, manslaughter, criminally negligent homicide. What's in common? We have a dead body. But where do they differ? Blameworthiness, the state of mind, okay? And that is an overview, a quick explanation of the approach to mens rea.